Hello, everyone. I hope you are doing well wherever you may be living. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. My name is Murtaza Kazmi, and today I'll be starting the first of hopefully many videos explaining congressional debate, the specific mechanisms of how to compete in this activity, and everything in between. Just a little bit of background about myself. Like I said, my name is Murtaza Kazmi. That is me right there. And I currently work as an assistant coach for congressional debate at Seven Lakes High School. I was a former competitor at that same high school for 4 years. And so I'd like to give back to the debate community that helped me so much and kind of explain a little bit about my experiences through congressional debate. So just as a quick disclaimer, this video is meant for beginners, but I hope if you're a bit more experienced, you'll also gain value from this video. And specifically, I'd like to focus on the rules as part of the Texas Forensics Association, or the TFA circuit. This video will still be valuable if you're a part of the National Speech and Debate Association or the National Circuit, or if you're competing in another circuit, such as the UIL circuit in Texas, because the differences between these circuits are very minute. However, the specific rules that I'll be discussing in today's video will be focused towards the TFA. So I think the first natural question to ask is, what is congressional debate? I think the best way to describe it is it's a high school debate event where students compete as if they were members of the US House of Representatives or the US Senate. So in the same way that members of Congress would be giving speeches on pieces of legislation, asking their fellow representatives about their speeches or about their views on a certain topic, and just in general, engage with other speakers or competitors, that's basically what's happening in student Congress or in congressional debate. So as a student, you can be giving speeches for or against a piece of legislation. You can be asking questions about other students' speeches during the questioning period. You can also participate through motions during the round. And finally, you can serve as a presiding officer. However, with the presiding officers, we'll discuss this more in detail in later lectures. I think as a new student coming to congressional debate, most important thing is to first establish yourself as a good speaker. And then once you do that, you can focus on becoming a good presiding officer later on. In terms of what I would say makes a successful student in congressional debate, it's about making cogent and then logical speeches. Make sure that your speeches are really easy to understand. I think the greatest rule of thumb for this is to imagine you explaining your speech to a toddler or to a younger sibling. And if they are able to understand it, then you know you made a very easy to understand speech. Otherwise, I would try and avoid too much flowery language, too much advanced language to ensure that everyone will have a general idea of what you're talking about. Second, I would say that you need to deliver your speeches with passion. You're not just informing an audience, you're trying to be persuading an audience in congressional debate to support your side over another side. And so as a result, you have to be really confident. You have to really be passionate about what you're talking about. And even if you may not resonate with the topic yourself, just try and imagine the situation that you're talking about, and hopefully that will inspire you to be very passionate and very confident when you're giving a speech. And finally, I would say it's important to remain involved in the round. Now, this is through both questioning and through giving motions throughout the round. And if you guys don't necessarily know the definitions of what I'm talking about, there's no need to worry. Further lectures and further along in this video, we'll kind of discuss the more intricate details behind all of these different terms. So in general, I would say the biggest skills that you would develop by participating in congressional debate is through public speaking, through debate, and through parliamentary procedure, or in other words, Robert's Rules of Order. So these are key skills that you can develop with this activity. I'm obviously a bit biased. I competed in this activity for 4 years, so I obviously really like it. So if you're a new student, you may not be familiar with what legislation actually is, and that's no need to worry about. Well, this legislation is going to be available on the Texas Forensics Association website, and I've put a quick link address over here So whenever you have the chance, look at the website, go to the Congressional Debate tab or the Congress tab, and you'll find the most up-to-date docket for that particular semester. So what is a docket? Well, a docket is about 30 pieces of legislation. And those are essentially the topics that you'll be debating throughout the semester at any one of these TFA tournaments that you're going to. Again, like I mentioned in the disclaimer at the top, if you're going to be going to a national circuit tournament or you're going to a UIL tournament, then your docket will not be the same. And so I would check in at that particular tournament or with your coaches to ensure that you're preparing for the right pieces of legislation. Now, like I mentioned earlier, there is a new docket each semester, one in the fall and one in the spring. And schools can submit up to 3 pieces of legislation for each docket. Now, there's some other information about dockets, but I would refer to the TFA Constitution. Again, it's in that same link here for more details about the dockets, because they're not too important for you as a competitor at the moment. Now, a common question that I get asked is, once you open up this TFA Congressional Debate docket, well, these bills and resolutions, they're not all the same. So what is a bill and what is a resolution? And that's a really good question. So a bill talks more about funds, about revenues, or other major policy that the US is involved in, okay? And a resolution, in contrast, is more symbolic in nature. So somewhere where the US does not have legal jurisdiction at. So an example is the US Congress has the ability to increase the budget of the Department of Defense, for example. They can increase that budget by $1 billion if they'd like to. And because of the Constitution, they have the rights and the powers to do so. However, let's look at a foreign conflict, for example, Israel-Palestine. No matter how much the US may want to intervene, they do not have direct control of neither Israel nor Palestine. So instead, if there's a certain thing or a certain problem that arises in that conflict, the US can issue a resolution in support or against a particular party, a particular event, a particular country. And so in this sense, the US doesn't have direct jurisdiction. They can't really do anything about specifically what Israel or what Palestine is doing in this example. However, the House of Representatives, the Senate, they can voice their discontent or their satisfaction with a certain event. And you'll see that a lot in foreign policy as well. Another key difference is that bills will have different sections, so sections 1 through 5, whereas a resolution will have whereas and resolve clauses. And if they're really complex, then they'll have further resolve clauses. So when you're looking at a resolution, you have to look at the resolved and further resolved clause. That's where the actual action of that piece of legislation is coming into play. Whereas for a bill, all of the sections are pretty relevant. Finally, I would say that bills have specific mechanisms and policy implementations, whereas resolutions are just general policy ideas with no specific mechanism. And this ties back to what I was discussing a little bit earlier. Bills have to be implemented. Once the US House of Representatives and the Senate pass a bill and it becomes a piece of legislation that has become law, then the bill must be implemented the exact same way that is discussed in the pieces of legislation themselves. Whereas resolutions, they may be more along the lines of the US generally supports the rights of Palestinians, or the US condemns Israeli settlements or something like that, to go back to that Israel-Palestine issue. So that's not a specific thing. There's nothing specifically that the US is doing in terms of maybe having sanctions or something like that. But instead, the US is voicing general support for or against a particular group. So these are more general in nature. Whereas a bill you'll typically find has specific mechanisms, specific fines, specific numbers, things like that. And so something to keep in mind during the debate is that when you're talking about a bill, you will be debating the specific mechanisms. So even if a solution is fantastic, if that solution is not going to be successful because of a certain part of that legislation, then you can still negate or speak against that piece of legislation. Whereas in a resolution, I would say talking about the mechanisms or the implementation plan of a resolution is kind of inconsequential. It's not too important because there is no means to implement a resolution. The final thing I'll say before we wrap up today's lecture is that you should always read the full piece of legislation. This is really important, and I think it's an issue where a lot of congressional debaters fall short of their expectations. And that is that in Congress, you're debating the piece of legislation, not the problem at hand. For example, if you're talking about a piece of legislation that has to deal with refugees, you may be incredibly sympathetic to refugees and rightfully believe that they deserve human rights. However, if a certain piece of legislation is actually going to be detrimental for refugees or not going to be impactful for those refugees, you can still negate or speak against that piece of legislation. So even though you're sympathetic for those causes, you're not necessarily in agreement with the way that a particular piece of legislation solves that issue. So always remember when making your speeches that you're talking about the piece of legislation and not the problem at hand necessarily. That'll wrap up this first of a series of lectures on congressional debate. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Please leave me feedback whenever possible. And for right now, take care. I'll see you guys next time.